All right. What's up, guys? So today, the topic of this video is becoming the one, becoming Neo. And this is part of a three-part series. This is part one. The three-part series is becoming Neo, becoming Morpheus, and then becoming the architect. All of those three characters are based on the movie The Matrix. And basically, how I broke this down is a three-step process. Now, this three-step process is in regards to what I refer to, or what is referred to as somewhat of an ego death and spiritual awakening process. So how I'm going to define this is that if you take a look at what's on the left right here, which is a visualization that I made called the artist way or the artist journey, you'll see this red line that goes through like this. Now, what this is you, it's energy. And the artist journey, the artist way, the spiritual awakening, everything like that is this process. Now, the first part of this process that we're going to focus on today is this part right here, which I will call the ego death. So how we're going to classify this is ego death is this part we're going inwards. So when you're looking at this side right here, let's say, is the external world, and then all the way on this side is the internal world. So going all the way from external to internal is that process, and then back to external. So the process of going from external to internal is the ego death. The point where there is a pivot would be spiritual awakening. And the point where we go from internal to external would be ego recreation. So ego deconstruction, spiritual awakening, ego reconstruction. So today, this video is focused on this part, the ego reconstruction or the ego death, aka becoming Neo, becoming the one. Now, when I say becoming the one, becoming Neo, I'm referring to the part of the Matrix where Neo is simply awakening to the system. Which you can see this video right here. That is just yeah, the reality. Okay. Wakening up to the reality of the situation. Now, some of you are getting to this point. You're not at this point completely, but you're getting to this point and you have questions, right? Now, when we're breaking down the ego, there's a lot of different layers of ego that can be broken down. How I broke this down was the relatability that you have of yourself to others. And so the closer you go inwards, the more relatable your experiences are going to be to other beings around you, right? So let's just say, for example, right, a social signifier at the very, very, very base surface level of social signifier, you have something like your job. You're a fucking sales manager, or you're I don't know, a product manager or whatever you're fucking doing. That is this at X company. You're doing that at X company. That is your sort of social status that people can identify you as, right? Then let's say we go a step further inwards. Your culture, your Indian, your American. Even in these cultures, there are certain subcultures. But overall, there is a larger culture. So it could be, nationality culture, geographic culture. These are sort of like cultural identities. Then let's say we go a step further, we have race. Um, because in cultures, you still have a sort of separation too. Um, race, skin tone, ethnicity, um, black, white, fair skin, dark skin, um, you know, race, religions, those sort of things. Then let's say we go another step inwards. Everybody has a sort of positioning within the family. Some are fathers, some are mothers, some are sons, some are sisters, some are brothers. You might play different sort of roles within that family. You might be a grandfather, a brother, and the son all at the same time. Then we go another step inwards, um, male, female. We're not going to discuss this, you know, genders a spectrum thing. We're not going to talk about that. I'm focused here on the two genders, male, female. I would probably maybe cover that in a different video. But male, female, if you're a man, if you're a woman, that's a very base level of relatability that it basically just splits in two. If you say, hey man, the men in the world is feel this, the women in the world, half the population is this, the other half is like this. Then at the core, right, we break it down, human. Um, if I go into a room and I say, hey, this is for all the humans in the room, everyone will be able to relate to that point. Then we want to go a step further into a sentient being. Now, this encompasses all of the sort of conscious beings that exist in the world, right? We got whales, fucking dogs, cats, horses, mouse, kangaroos. Those are all conscious beings. And as people, we are also part of that, I guess, system of consciousness, of conscious beings, right? Like you wouldn't go and say a rock is a conscious being. Um, so at our very, very, very core of relatability to the external world is the fact that we're all conscious beings. And so the further out you go from this layer, right? The sentient being, I'm gonna zoom in on this right here. The further out you go from this core level of conscious or sentient being, the more division happens, right? So every time I step out, I divide a little bit further when at the core we're all the same thing. So if I step out from a conscious being, a human, that eliminates all the other conscious beings. If I step out from a human and I say, oh, male, female, that eliminates half right off the back. If I say, family, if I say the father's in the room, or if I say the mother's in the room, that takes off, another group of people. If I say, okay, the Arab father's in the room, or let's say I say the European sisters in the room, um, you know, that it just goes that separates more and more. So then you go all the way back to the very surface level, um, like if I say like the project managers in the room, that might be like one or two people, if I say um the finance people in the room, that might be just a few people, um so those are the sort of the layers of ego that we operate from and that we see the world, and that creates our sort of perspective of the world. And that creates a very unique perspective, because when you add up all those things, when you add up from here all the way to here, and you question, okay, I'm this and this and this, etc., that creates a sort of one of a kind perspective in the world. And that's something that you have to understand. But however, when you are starting to sort of wake up and question, right? You say, but I didn't choose this religion. Let's say you grew up in a Christian family. You grew up in a Christian family. You were born in let's say Kentucky, and you grew up in a Christian household. And you start to just have a period of awakening. Now, awakening generally comes from periods of isolation, because periods of isolation, what that does is that it allows you to separate more from this external and keep going internal more and more and more. So that isolation brings you, it's like it pushes you back. It's like boom, every time you have a long period of reflection, isolation, you step back, and you question what you are and who you are. And so that's really the sort of birth of the questions that breed the ego death. And this is a big component of why people get depressed and everything like that, which I'm going to talk about in a different video. But ego death has a very big part and role to play in that. So back to the example, let's say you're born into a Christian family in Kentucky, right? And you start to isolate, you start to feel different, you start to have these questions, and you say, well, I didn't choose this belief system. I didn't choose to support this political party. I didn't choose to be born into this family. I didn't choose to have this name. I didn't choose to have this skin color. I didn't choose to have this specific gender. And those are sort of the questions that start to arise when you start waking up. And that feeling will be somewhat further isolating, because unless you're around people who have experienced that, people who haven't experienced that aren't going to understand what you're talking about. And you're going to start to see the world from a very, very, very different lens. Because the way that you see the world at the very surface, right? If you've never questioned or anything, you just take it at the very surface level right here. Compared to if you put everything out front like this, you have a much deeper view of the world, and that you can relate and understand to people. And that ego death, when you start to lose your identity in what you are and what you're doing, that can be a scary feeling. Because a lot of that is also wrapped in the sort of game that you're involved with. So when we construct this ego or this identity, the first identity that's given to us is the one that's given to us at birth externally. So what I was saying before, like, you didn't choose those things. Those are that first ego, that first identity is the one that was placed to you from the external world. And that's who you think you are, probably, until you go up to, the spiritual awakening. You think you're those things. You think you're that. And in that, there's a sort of game. So let's say, like, in this Christian family from Kentucky, right? The parents are doctors, and your whole family has been in the medical field. Um, for example, let's just say they are like surgeons or orthopedic surgeons or dentists or whatever. They're in the medical field. Um, and they expect you to also be in the medical field, or it could be a different field. It could be law, or it could be, you know, um, law enforcement or something like that. There's a sort of game that's associated with that. Also, geographic, right? You didn't choose to be born into this geographic space or location that you were born into. Um, and so this whole sort of web upholds the idea of this identity that you have of yourself, or this ego that you have of yourself, right? So the web that you're supported in, right? Your family supports this idea of who you are. Your local community supports this idea of who you are. If you're in school, the school supports this idea of who you think you are. And that has a lot to do with perception, which I'm going to talk about in another video. So it creates a sort of invisible box around you of perception, all supporting this character or this idea that you think is you. Um, and when you start having this spiritual awakening and you say, well, these things aren't me, and you start having different interests or different um, ideas that deviate from that sort of webs, from this sort of glass box of the system that supports this idea of you, you're going to meet a lot of resistance. Um, you're going to meet a lot of resistance because once people put you in this glass box of he's this, she's this, or this person's XYZ, it is very, very difficult for them to readjust their view of that. And when you try to step out of that glass box, they're going to look at you as if something is wrong with you, because who you want to be, who you're trying to be, or who you're dissolving from doesn't match the sort of general consensus of the idea that they have of you. Um, so let's just stay on this example of the Christian family in Kentucky. Okay, now let's say you start going through a spiritual awakening, right? You start asking yourself these questions and everything, and you go out and you start listening to some heavy metal bands, or you start, you know, listening to a ton of reggae, or you start listening to I don't know, Japanese anime, or whatever it is, that's very different from the consensus of the idea of who you are. Because this whole time, let's say like 0 to like 18 or whatever, you've never done that. You've never explored those things for yourself, but you started taking interest in things that are not, I don't want to say acceptable, but in that glass box. They're not accepted in that glass box. So you're stepping out, you're saying, okay, this actually looks kind of interesting. I want to go and look at this. People are looking at you like, that doesn't match my expectations of you. Um, and that is going to be pretty frustrating. That's going to be pretty frustrating because what's going to happen is that there's going to be a clash. There's going to be a clash of who you think you are, who you think you could be, who you were. Um, and all of those things are going to clash at the same time. Who you think you are, who you think you could be, and who you were, all those things are going to clash. And you have to sort of break that first worldview that was given onto you. And that's where the ego death really comes from. Breaking that first identity, breaking that first mold. And that's really sort of the start of the awakening process. Realizing that your identity isn't wrapped up in the sort of external world, if that makes sense. Yeah. All right, let me see. Okay. Stop recording.